Welcome to the YES program ADA 30th anniversary webinar on disability rights and advocacy. My name is Micah Faber and I'm the YES program coordinator at Iron USA, one of the implementing organizations of the YES program. Before we begin, let's go over a quick review of some of the features in this Zoom room so that all attendees can navigate and participate seamlessly. We have 2 ASL interpreters and a live captioner at this webinar today. If you would like to see the live captioning, please click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your toolbar. Please let us know if you have trouble finding the button. I'll give everyone a few seconds to turn on closed captioning. Great. We also have 2 ASL interpreters joining us today. Full access to ASL interpretation is available for any participant who is deaf or uses sign language as their primary form of communication. If you'd like to have full access to ASL interpretation, please send us a message via the chat box. Please remember to set your chat box settings to all panelists and attendees, so everyone can participate in the discussion. We encourage you to chat and ask questions throughout the webinar. And many of you have already told us where you're joining from, which is really exciting to see. So if you haven't already, please let us know who you are and where you are joining from. We will also be using polls throughout the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. Let's see, Moise, could you actually launch the first poll for me? It's going to ask who you are. So if you are a YES alum, a YES student, a YES staff member. So just a moment, we'll get that up there. Great, so you should be seeing a poll on your screen. So please select the answer that suits you best. Keep that open for just a couple more seconds. All right, Moise, could you share the results, please?
Yes. Hi and hello, everyone. My name is Moise Rehan, and I also work at Iron USA with Micah and Emma. So the results we have so far is 5% yes students, 33% yes alumni, 23% yes staff, and 34% other. So that's quite exciting.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So we are also recording this webinar. So if you missed anything or you want to watch it again after the event, you can watch it on yesprograms.org or our YouTube page. We will hopefully be on Facebook Live soon, but we are having a bit of technical difficulty with that. So we will let you know if we are in Facebook Live in a few minutes. Wonderful. Next slide, please. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar. 2020 marks the 30 years since the American with Disabilities Act, ADA, was signed into law in the United States. This landmark legislation prohibits discrimination based on disability and increases the opportunities and access for persons with disabilities. The law was written and passed to ensure that persons with disabilities have the same rights as other Americans. Today's webinar is all about the history of the ADA, how people with disabilities are being impacted by COVID-19 right now, and how YES alumni all around the world can advocate for persons with disabilities by developing disability-centered and inclusive projects. Before we begin, I would like to ask the audience how familiar you are with the ADA. You will see a poll question on your screen in a few seconds. Please select the answer that best describes your familiarity with the ADA. So are you very familiar, a little familiar, or do you not know what the ADA is? Great. And Moise, do you mind sharing the results with us again? Great. So most people are a little familiar with the ADA, and some people are very familiar, and some people don't know what the ADA is. So we hope that at the end of this webinar, you will be a little bit more familiar with the ADA and will have some best practices in mind for developing inclusive service projects and how to support persons with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. So before we begin, I would like to introduce our two fantastic speakers that are joining us today. We have Johelini Marin, who is a program coordinator at Mobility International USA with the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, working to increase the participation of people with disabilities in international exchange. As an intern with the American Association for People with Disabilities, Johelini worked at the National Disability Rights Network, promoting inclusion of people with disabilities in emergency response and preparedness. A Dominican immigrant and native Spanish speaker, Johelini has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Global Public Health with a minor in Disability Studies from New York University, having been motivated to pursue an international disability rights career after experiencing accessibility shock during a visit to her home country. Johelini studied abroad at NYU London, England as a Global Equity Fellow, where she was tasked with improving resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also have Safira Bibi joining us today, who is a 2013 YES alumna from Pakistan and was the first blind student to go to the US through the Youth Exchange and Study program. Safira's experience in America was a defining moment of her life. In America, she was able to do laundry, travel on her own, and manage her budget. When Safira returned back to Pakistan, she realized that her country lacks opportunities with students with visual impairments, and the responsibility of advocating for the opportunities for visual impaired students lies on the shoulders of those who have had the privilege and opportunity to educate themselves. It was then that Safira began conducting workshops and camps for visually impaired youth on mobility and life skills. Today, Safira works with multiple NGOs and private institutions to work on advocacy and outreach components of projects, particularly dealing with youth with visual impairments. She also conducts sessions to inspire and motivate youth to achieve their goals. Thank you so much to Johelini and Safira for joining us today. I would now like to hand it off to Johelini to kick off our event and share with us a little bit more about the history and significance of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So Moise, if you could stop sharing your screen, and Johelini, you can go ahead and share your PowerPoint.
Can everybody see the presentation?
It's currently loading. Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that amazing introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Johelini. It's nice to have you all with us today, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the ADA. And I'm looking forward to giving you some more information on what that is. So I'm going to get us started with a brief history timeline of what led to the ADA. So in the 1800s, the perspective of people with disabilities was that people with disabilities were considered tragic, pitiful individuals, unfit and unable to contribute to society. And at the end of World War I, veterans with disabilities were expecting the US government to provide rehabilitation and exchange for their service to the nation. Then between the 1940s and the 1960s, disability became more prevalent because World War II veterans injured that now had disabilities made it more visible for disability issues to the citizens who were thankful for their service and were concerned about the long-term welfare of the young men. And in 1960s, during the civil rights movement, a lot of disability advocates took notice of the way that the civil rights movement was moving along, demanding rights for African Americans. Then, during the 1970s, the Rehabilitation Act was passed, and in that act, disability advocates lobbied and marched to include language so that people with disabilities also had rights. And this was Section 504. It provided equal opportunity for employment within federal government and federally funded programs, and it prohibited discrimination on the basis of both physical or mental disability. It also included the architectural and transportation barriers, which talks about mandating equal access and public services, such as transportation, housing, and rehab services. Section 504, although the Rehabilitation Act passed in 1973, was not signed until 1977 after a 28-day sitting. And I'll be able to share a video that you can see to learn more about that later. Then between the 1980s and the 1990s, in 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed to guarantee equal rights and access to public education for children with physical disabilities. And in 1990, it was renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Act. In 1980, disability advocates began lobbying to sort of consolidate a lot of legislation and laws to become one broad civil rights law to protect people with disabilities. And in 1990, it was passed. So what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? You heard a little bit in the beginning, but I'm gonna go into a little more information and detail. So it's a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. This includes schools, transportation, restaurants, both public and private places that provide services to the general public. And as I mentioned, it was signed in 1990, July 26th of 1990. And most recently, amendments were made in 2008 to make changes to the definition of disability. So I mentioned in the beginning with the brief history of the perspective of people with disabilities, one of the things that the disability rights movement did was change that perspective. It worked towards changing the way that people think about disability, to consider that all people with disabilities are individuals with rights, that they experience discrimination, violation of those rights, and that they experience both environmental and attitudinal barriers. And solutions to these issues include removing those barriers, protecting disabled people's rights by enforcing laws, and empowering people with disabilities through education, employment, and accommodations. On the side here, you'll see an image of a world globe with the words disabling world in the center and yellow arrows going out to titles like what are the barriers, environmental barriers, communication, editorial, and organizational barriers. So who is protected under the ADA? That's a question a lot of people ask. And it comes in threes. So it protects the civil rights of individuals who have a physical or mental impairment that has been recorded and is regarded as having such impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And major life activities means essentially things like walking, hearing, seeing, learning, and more. Some of the disabilities, apparent disabilities, include hearing impairment or deafness, mobility impairment, visual impairments, or temporary disabilities. And some non-apparent disabilities include chronic health conditions and illnesses, mental health, such as depression or anxiety, and learning disabilities, such as ADHD and dyslexia. This is just a list to provide examples, but it does not include all the disabilities covered in the ADA. So what does the ADA protect? It protects people with disabilities by ensuring access to different things. Employment, access to public services, access to places of public accommodation. And in Title I, it specifically talks about employment and prohibits discrimination in employment. It also requires that employers provide reasonable accommodations. And reasonable accommodations include things like some of the services and supports you're getting in this call, like an ASL interpreter, captions, or other services. Then Title II talks about access to public services. This ensures that people with disabilities have access to civic life. And civic life includes all state and local governments, community recreation, and more. And then access to places of public accommodations. This essentially talks about private businesses and nonprofit organizations that offer goods and services to the general public, like restaurants, theaters, doctors' offices, fitness clubs, and other privately owned businesses that provide services to the public. Sorry about that. And then we have telecommunications, which requires telephone and internet companies to provide nationwide system with telecommunication relay services. An example of what it does is require closed captioning of federally funded public service announcements. And hopefully we'll talk a little more about that later. So now that I've sort of given you examples and told you more about the ADA, I want to perhaps hear a little in the chat of how do you think the ADA impacted the lives of people with disabilities once it was passed? I hope some of you were able to put down some answers in the chat, and I'll share some examples, and hopefully I'll get to hear from you all during the next section. So the impact of the ADA. The act basically allowed people with disabilities the right to fully participate in the communities and ensured access in public accommodations, as I mentioned. So some specific examples include curve cuts that allow wheelchair users to move freely within their neighborhoods. And it is also an example of how services and supports that are provided to people with disabilities don't just benefit people with disabilities, but benefits everyone. Because parents with strollers or someone in the older generation is able to also make use of those ramps to move around more easily. There's also ramps and lifts on buses. So being able to use transportation and travel freely. It also includes communication, so availability of ASL interpreters in news and captioning in TV shows and films. And then sidewalks, as I'm sure some of you notice traveling to the US. Many of our sidewalks include saying out loud when it's safe to cross, and this helps blind users know when it's safe to cross the street. And employment, which basically states that whether you're disabled or non-disabled, people must be considered equally for hiring. So the ADA is a great piece of legislation, and there's many ways to enforce it, but there's still some work that has to be done and still areas that can be improved in terms of access for people with disabilities. For example, we talked about how the ADA prohibits discrimination in employment, yet 19.3% of people with disabilities are employed compared to 66.3% of their non-disabled peers. And in terms of visibility and representation, we saw in the beginning of the presentation during the brief history that visibility of disability meant that people notice needs. And so to know that 80% of all disabled actors on the small screen are portrayed by non-disabled actors really says a lot about how there's still work to be done about the perspective of people with disabilities and their right to represent themselves in their own stories. It also, in representation, we talk about education. And during the poll earlier, we saw that not a lot of people knew about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is not something that's unfamiliar within Americans as well, just because the disability rights movement and its history is not something that's taught in schools at a younger age. For example, I didn't really learn much about the disability rights movement until I was in college. And then political access. So when it comes to voting, some polling places are physically inaccessible. They may have a steep ramp or a step in the front, or they lack accessible voter machines that would allow people with disabilities, such as blind people, to have access to participate in voting. And then independent living. So people with disabilities have the right to live in their communities, but too often they're institutionalized due to a lack of resources to support that they live independently within the community. So implementation of the law. One of the key components of the ADA is that it's a mechanism, it has mechanisms and funding for enforcement that are incorporated in the law to ensure that the law is actually implemented. One way that this is done as well is that there are what we call ADA national network, and it's pretty much centers across the nation that provide information, guidance, and training on how to implement the Americans with Disabilities Act. So an effective law that is implemented and enforced is a powerful tool for the rights of people with disabilities. And if it's not implemented, it's not as easy. And then there's also the fact that laws are most effective when they're accompanied by a shift in perspective by and about people with disabilities. So what are, I want you to think about what could be the laws in your own countries and how the rights of people with disabilities are protected. So in most countries, disability rights have disability rights, but the rights are not enforced. Many countries are working to align their laws with what is known as the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, CRPD. And the CRPD is an international treaty that identifies the rights of people with disabilities. And governments and countries that sign are obligated to promote, protect, and ensure those rights. And a good thing to be informed of and know about is that international students with disabilities studying in the US are also protected under the ADA, which means they are entitled to services and supports to fully participate in their studies. So lastly, I just wanted to share some other events and resources so that you can continue to learn more. And first, there's the Joining Hands. It's something that is through the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange at MIUSA. And it's going to be a virtual gathering of disability and international exchange professional and participants to discuss how to make international exchange more inclusive so that more students with disabilities can participate. The State Department's Educational and Cultural Affairs is promoting and featuring a lot of stories of alumni with disabilities that have participated in international exchange. There's also a campaign going on right now with Crip Camp, a new film that came out that is offering a free online course to have conversations regarding disability and the disability rights movement. And unfortunately, due to everything that's going on, a lot of these events have had to shift to virtual settings. And so a lot of them are still in planning, but a great way to keep in touch and find out what other events are happening is to follow the hashtag ADA30 in social media.
Great. Johanny, thank you so much for sharing your insight and knowledge about the ADA. This was really informative, and it's really great to learn a little bit more about the history and the activism that went into passing this law 30 years ago. So thank you all for chatting in the chat box some of your comments about how you think the ADA has impacted people with disabilities. I want to open up the floor for questions. So if you have questions about the ADA, its significance, its impact, what we can do to continue advocating for people with disabilities, please share your questions and comments in the chat. Johanny, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about how the ADA impacts international students like YES students who come to the US.
Yes, of course. So international students, as I mentioned, are covered under the ADA. So the same supports that Americans with disabilities receive in schools and in the community are available to support students with disabilities. So providing accommodations in class, such as having an ASL interpreter or having someone to help during the school, and a lot of other services and supports that are just, it's the same, it would be qualified as the same as any American living in the US.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That's really applicable to our YES students, and I'm sure a lot of YES alumni who are joining today have experienced that impact during their time in the US. Johanny, I was wondering if you have any advice. I know you shared out a lot of resources, which we will be sharing out on social media after this webinar as well, so don't worry if you missed that. But I was wondering if you have some advice about how people can self-educate on issues concerning people with disabilities and become advocates for change.
Sure, of course. That's a great question. So at the end of the presentation, I provided some links for further information based on also information that I found for the presentation. So if you want to learn more about the specifics of the different titles and what it really means to, what about the ADA protects people with disabilities in employment, then you can learn more about that. It's also great to seek out disability rights activists and advocates in social media, especially right now with Grip Camp. There's a lot of buzz around just featuring people with disabilities and having it known. There's a lot of activists that have great social media platforms, and it's really about reaching out to people with disabilities themselves and understanding and accepting their lived experience. So my best advice would be to seek out people with disabilities and have conversations with them, not questioning or trying to get information about their specific disabilities, but more about what they are willing to share in terms of their own experience with disability and what that looks like for them on a day-to-day life. And like I mentioned, I myself, I am a person with a disability. I use a manual wheelchair to navigate and move around, and I have cerebral palsy, and I did not learn about the Americans with Disabilities Act fully until I was in college. And so it's really about seeking out that information, and if you have it, sharing it with others, because the truth is that disability is just a part of the human experience. And whether you're someone who has a disability or someone who knows someone with a disability within your family, it's really important to know how to support, but also how to be great partners and allies in the work.
Absolutely. Yeah, and knowledge about this is so important, and I hope that everyone at the webinar today can learn something and share it with someone else who might not know what the ADA is. So we have a few questions in the chat box, and I'll hopefully get to all of them by the end of the webinar. But if not, we hopefully will address them later on. So one of the questions was about how to specifically advocate for mental health issues. So, if people don't know, that mental health is insured, supported by the ADA, or what advice do you have for specifically advocating for people with mental health issues?
Well, I would say, again, it's about talking to the people that experience mental health disabilities and what that means for them. I can't specifically talk to the experience because I'm not a person myself um, that experiences that, but I do think that it's important to talk about mental health and to understand the cultural context of mental health within different communities and countries. Um, a lot of how you're able to understand and seek out support really stems from the culture that you come from and the information that's been available to you so far. So I would specifically say that mental health is not something to be shamed about or shameful of, but it's something that can be managed and lived with if you seek out the right support and help. And it's really about just offering that help to others and just being completely okay with the fact that someone might not be ready to seek out supports because they're still trying to understand it themselves. So it's really an individual thing, but it's more about acceptance and just letting others live and just learn.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I saw another question about how, if we could share a little advice about how to make alumni projects more inclusive. And that's actually what we'll get into a little bit later in this webinar. And Safira will be sharing some of her experience. So I want to move into a little bit of a conversation about the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all experiencing the effects of right now. Obviously, it's impacting people all over the world. And Jolini and Safira, I want to pose this question to both of you. What challenges are people with disabilities facing right now during the COVID-19 pandemic?
I can get started. So I think a lot of the things that I mentioned during the presentation that are still things that are being worked on and still need to be supported in are also things that are shining perhaps during the COVID-19 and what effects are there. So a lot of people are experiencing hardship with not being able to access all of the services that they need to remain in their communities. And that means that they are in danger of perhaps having to seek the support of an institution. And to be honest, people with disabilities are at a greater risk to be exposed to COVID in these institutions. And it's really about just the fact that there are a limited number of staff that are available. And so someone that is attending to an individual who's already infected with COVID might also be attending and supporting someone who is not. And so the spread is more likely to happen. There's also communication barriers, like people not having ASL interpreters during their news announcements. And because of COVID changing rapidly and things just going from one thing to the next, it is important for people with disabilities and people who are hard of hearing or deaf to be able to get the same information that other people are getting. And it's it's really important because yes, there is captioning, but people who have ASL as their first language might not understand the material as well if they're just reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really, really good points to think about. Safira, in your experience, do you have anything to share about what people with disabilities are facing right now during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Actually, I'm getting trouble with my screen reader. I would really appreciate if you repeat your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So my question was, what challenges are people with disabilities facing right now during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Perfect. Well, if you see the first phase of disability, okay, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Okay. So the first phase was disability, they were at home and they were like living life like a statue. They didn't have to do anything. But after that, they got some socialization, they got some work to do, and they work on their acceptance. Like if you see for past few years, they were working and they're working really hard to accept themselves in the society. But the COVID-19 make them again isolated, again lock them down. I'm kind of afraid about those people who are who don't have internet accessibility, who don't have computer accessibility. So what I see is the mental health issues. So we are working on it. So we are connecting them to the person with disabilities to consulate them. So which is I guess this is the huge thing they're troubling. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Safira, can you share a little bit about what you're doing and what other people could do to support people with disabilities right now during the pandemic?
Just a minute. I'm just okay. Okay. Thank you. Actually, you know what? I'm having some trouble with my screen reader. What question are you asking? It repeats that question. So I just have to listen to both of you. What am I doing is we just started a project called Bridge the Gap. It is about employment, and I participated in inclusivity workshop in Ghana, where I committed with myself that I'm going to work on employment with visually impaired students. So we just started that project in March, and then we got locked down. So now we do is we are working, we are teaching the technical things like how to use Excel, how to use the content writing, and now we are working on mental health, which is I think is very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So, Safira, what other projects have you been involved with since you've become a YES alumna? And can you share with us how you've advocated for people with disabilities since you were on the program in 2012?
Okay. So that's very great question. Is I would say is the yes journey was the turning point of my life. So I see myself a totally different picture after my yes journey. So when I got back to my home country, I committed with myself that hey, now is the time for me to give back my community whatever I have learned during my yes journey. So this is what I am doing. I'm at the beginning I was working disability center projects. Now I am working on inclusivity projects because what I believe is that the most important thing is to accept yourself. Before being advocate for yourself, you have to be advocate for your own self. That you have to accept accept yourself, you have to accept your disability. So we are working on it, and we are running projects, and I am utilizing Yes platform to do this, like the little contribution from my side.
Great. Thank you so much, Safira. What advice do you have for YES alumni who are trying to develop more projects that are inclusive and disability centered?
Yeah, excuse me. That's but the first thing we have to do, if you are interested to work with a marginalized community, like if you want to work with disability, so I would suggest that the first thing you have to do is you need to bring the empathy instead of sympathy, So for example, if you want to work with visually impaired people, so that's what I am. So yeah, that's a great example from my side to give that. If you want to work with like visually impaired people, what you have to do, just sit you with yourself and close your eyes and live their life, and live the challenges that they are facing, and then come to the design to the project. So I would appreciate that, like whoever want to work with disability, you need to live their life, you need to be them before designing any project for them. And then appreciate your idea. If you got an idea to work, this is about me, whenever I get an idea, I always feel that I'm the responsible to implement this idea, and I'm the chosen for this idea. So this is what you have to do. You got an idea, never put down your idea, never ignore your idea. You just have to work on. But before doing anything, you just have to be like them. So then you will be the best person to do something productive for them. So yeah, I would advise that you will get lots of challenges to do these kind of projects, but never give up and do what you love to do. Yep.
Absolutely. That's really, really great advice. Safira, could you share kind of a highlight project? I see some of the photos here on the shared screen. Could you share a highlight project that you worked on? I know you mentioned a couple, but go into detail about a project that you have, an inclusive project that you've worked on since becoming a YES alumna, and how that has changed your community.
Okay. I myself don't remember that how many projects I have done with by using by utilizing Yes platform. So some of them are like the first project I have done, that was workshop, 9-day workshop. That was let's become independent, which is I learned during my Yes journey, my Yes year. So I became independent blind person. This is what I have that was my starting project. I did in my former school with visually impaired people, where I was working on mobility and orientation and mobility and personal development. This was my first project. Like after completing this project, I got inner satisfaction, which made me to design projects again and again. Yeah, and it's kind of really hard for me to give words to my satisfaction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That
And
makes sense.
you were sharing the pictures. Yeah. So this was the disability center project. After that, I was doing lots of projects, but the inclusive project was VR1. I have done with visually impaired people and sighted people. What I have done is I just collected some students and make them ready, and give them this awareness that how to face those challenges whenever you work with like regular people. And then I took them to the sighted school where they interacted with sighted people. And this was all about acceptance, because I believe on the first door is acceptance, and we have to open the door. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you, I'm sure, I mean, it sounds like you've done so many projects since becoming Yes Alumna. And I'm sure you've worked with other Yes Alumni and other community members on your projects. Can you share a little bit about how you got others involved in your projects and volunteers engaged in your passion?
Okay. Um, well, you know, usually if we have Yes Alumni here, I would like to suggest them that you plan projects, you want to do something, and you need some people like your partners to do work with you, and you post it on Facebook or somewhere that you require some volunteers, you require some alumni. Sometime you will not get any of them to work with you, and this is the time for you to not give up your project. At that time you have to ask your private, yeah, like your personal friends, your family members to work with you. For me is like I some like most of time, my Yes Alumni friends didn't have time to come with me and to work with me. So what I was doing is I was asking my own friends, even my neighbors, and even my mom, and she was coming with me and working with me when several times. So this could be challenged sometime, but be positive that everyone has work to do their own. So be positive and never give up. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Safira. We had one question come in through the Q&A section, and it says, how can I join Safira's project? So is there a way that people can join you? Are you doing any virtual projects right now?
Hello.
Yes, Safira, we can hear you.
Yeah. Are you asking something?
Yeah, so we got a question from a participant that asked, how can you join a project that you are working on? So are you doing any projects that is open to other people joining you?
Okay. Is there someone join me to work with me? This is what you're asking?
Yeah, someone's interested in joining your project.
Oh yes, oh, why not? We have our own Facebook page. We have, you can join me because the time is going on, the situations are going on. We are doing virtual sessions, virtual all the things come to the digitalization. So anywhere and anytime you can join, and I would love to have people. And thank you for that.
Awesome, great. Johanni and Safira, I was wondering, do you have advice for how people can get engaged right now, particularly virtually? What can people do to help out from home to get engaged virtually, and are there best practices to keep in mind?
Sure. I think that something to keep in mind now that we have so many virtual events going on is to really consider how to make those events accessible to people with disabilities. So there are some things happening on this webinar right now, like having ASL interpreters and live captioning available, are things that you can do to make sure that all participants that come to your virtual events are able to participate fully. We have some resources at MIUSA that you can perhaps look into in terms of making virtual events accessible, or making your presentations, PowerPoint presentations, more accessible. For example, one of the tips that we talk about is verbalizing any visuals that you may have on your presentation, so that anyone with a visual impairment can know everything that you are showing, and also color contrast in a presentation to make sure that everyone can see the material as much as possible. And there are a lot of other tips that you can sort of keep in mind when you're presenting or when you're providing a virtual event. I think one of the best ways to know about what is happening with COVID and people with disabilities is to maintain informed, perhaps even reach out to um, organizations, that disabled people's organizations in your local communities about how you can support people with disabilities and what efforts they are working on to ensure that people with disabilities in the communities are informed and are getting the services they need. As I mentioned earlier, communication is a big thing. So just learning more about whether the national announcements and televised announcements are there's sign language provided depending on what the sign language is in each country, and just really just reaching out to people with disabilities to know what supports they need, or perhaps even how other people can partner with them to support things that are needed and that the community is lacking.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Johanny. Safira, do you have any best practices to share for virtual programming that people can participate in during this time? Safira, I think you're on mute. Do you have any best practices to share for virtual programming? We can't hear you because you're muted.
Hello.
Yes, now we can hear you.
I'm so sorry for this.
No
Well,
worries.
the huge challenge we are facing, that we have our own participants that we are working on, that they were like not very familiar with digitalization. They were not familiar with this online, the things are going on. So the COVID-19 is making them to learn these things. So the first thing we are doing is that we are teaching them the connection things, like they are having problem to use Zoom, they're having problem to use the Google Classroom and the Google Form and those things. That this is what we are, the first thing we are teaching them those things. And then again, like later on, we have plans to bring them in one place. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so trying out different things, making sure, as Johanny said, that virtual programming is accessible, and reaching out to people with disabilities in your community and asking what they need. Absolutely.
Yes.
So another question that we got was, if you have any tips on how exchange students can make projects more inclusive. You've already kind of talked a little bit about that, but more importantly, how to promote what ADA advocates for and implement it in our own countries.
I would say that the first step to sort of understanding how rights are in your own country is to just go and see what their involvement with the Convention for People with Disabilities is, and what the country's disability rights are. And then the next step would be to reach out to disabled people's organizations locally and find out how they are, what they are advocating the law to improve on, or what they think the law is lacking, so that you know how to support ADA efforts in those countries. So as mentioned, a lot of the guidelines in the Convention for People with Disabilities is based on principles from the ADA. So if you're looking at international law and what it is in each country, then you're basically just getting an understanding of what disability rights looks like in your country.
Yeah, absolutely. Safira, do you have any tips to share on how to advocate for what the ADA stands for and how to implement that in other countries?
Well, the earlier I shared that we have to be like, I'm assuming that most of people we have today, they are not facing any kind of disability, but they are interested to work with disability, right? So nothing about us without us. So what you have to do, you need to take on board those people who are facing disability, ask them that what they really need, and include them and let them to participate in your projects, so you will find better idea to work with them. So without them and without asking, without getting them into your projects, you cannot be advocate for them, right? So because this is their real need and they know that what they actually want. So this is what you have to do. And I would say that if you want to work with disability, the first thing you have to do, let them to come to you and let them to, participate in your projects. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. Nothing about us without us. I think that's a really great piece of advice. Joheleni and Safira, do you have any other questions for each other? Anyone watching, do you have any other questions for our speakers? Please share them. And yeah, Joheleni and Safira, if you have any other questions or thoughts to share, please do so.
Well, I would just like to say thank you, Safira, for sharing that. Nothing about us without us is definitely a mantra of the disability rights movement, and it's very important. It's definitely a best practice that you can implement with anything that you do, is just not only let people participate, let people with disabilities participate in your projects, but partner up with people with disabilities so that they are able to tell you what it is that the community needs. So yeah, thank you, Safira, for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Safira, we did get one more question for you from the chat box. And it's, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced while doing your projects in Pakistan?
What are the challenges? What are you?
Yeah, what are some challenges
Okay.
that you've faced?
Okay, yeah. The challenges I'm still facing is, the acceptance challenges, because still people have a problem. Still people are like, they are not believing that you can do or you cannot do. And this is the one word that you cannot do, and this is what I am still facing. And during my exchange year, after coming back from USA and I'm doing work, and it's still people are telling me, hey, Safira, this is Pakistan, this is not America. So I usually sometimes I am fed up. What's going on? It's like you are in Pakistan and you don't need to consider it America. So this all about your thoughts, your thinking. It's not about America or Pakistan. So this is what I am facing, the acceptance problems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One other question that just came in was, how can we start projects with students with disabilities? How do you go about starting a project and reaching out to your community?
Okay, so are you asking me?
Yeah, go ahead, Safira.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, that if you got an idea to work, that idea always can be a problem. There's something that you are thinking that it should be happen. So that could be your idea. So when you get idea, I'm again saying that you are responsible to implement that idea, and think that you are chosen for that idea to be implemented. So you just have to give priority to your idea and design a project around your idea. Never think that your idea is going to change nothing. Never think that your idea has to be, it has to be really big, it has to do lots of things. Don't do that. If your idea is going to change one thing, then I would appreciate go through it. So if you are exchange student and you went to USA and you came back to your home country, and I believe that you have learned so many things during your exchange year. So this is what you can teach in your home country, and believe me, this is the goal for all of us. Like I'm telling about our alumni, that this is the goal for us to send to the USA to learn things and give back those learning experience to our home country. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That was beautifully said. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was really great to hear your expertise and your knowledge and about your experience, and to hear from all of you attending as well. Thank you for adding your comments and questions into the chat box. We really, really appreciate it. I want everyone to know that we are going to continue sharing out resources, events, history, facts, knowledge about the ADA leading up to the anniversary, which is July 26th. So stay tuned on our social media and participate. We will, provide a lot more information in the next few weeks. Before we leave, we do want to launch 3 more polls to gather some information about what you learned at the webinar today. So Moise, when you're ready, if you don't mind sharing the first poll. So after participating in this webinar, are you more confident in your ability to share about the impact of the ADA? We can leave that open for a few more seconds. All right, and Moise, do you mind sharing the results? Great, so 82% of you said very confident, which is really, really exciting to see. And we hope that you take the knowledge that you learned today and share it out with your communities, and hopefully start some exciting projects. Moise, do you mind sharing the second poll? So after this webinar, do you feel more confident leading projects that are disability-centered and inclusive? And when you're ready, please share the results. So 61% of you say very confident and 35% say somewhat confident. That's really great to see as well. And we'll continue sharing out resources for how to develop and implement disability-centered and inclusive projects throughout the next few weeks. So if there's more information that you want to hear about specifically, let us know. And we're happy to provide that information and engage in those conversations with all of you. Moise, please launch the third poll. Thank you. Do you anticipate leading a disability-centered and inclusive project to celebrate the ADA in July? So please answer this poll if you're planning on leading a project. And when you're ready, please share the results, Moise. So 59% say yes and 34% say maybe. That's really awesome. We hope you all should, start an inclusive and disability-centered project in your community. Share your questions with us, continue to share resources with each other. And we hope you all learned something from the webinar today. So Thank you all again for joining. Remember to follow the ADA30 hashtag on all our social media to stay engaged in the conversation. There'll be lots of events happening around the anniversary in July, so please stay in touch about that and follow us. And if you have any other questions, the chat box is still open, so feel free to let us know. Thank you all so much. Thank you also to our ASL interpreters, Kelly and Rebecca, and to our live captioners, Steve. We really, really appreciate you joining us today. And again, thank you to Jolini and Safira for sharing your insight and knowledge. I hope you all have a really wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.